Welcome everyone thanks for coming to this webinar. We're going to be talking about the intersection of domestic violence and intellectual and developmental disabilities. My name is Tatiana Parilla, also pronounced Tatiana Parilla. Today is March 31st, 2023. If you're watching before, you'll know that I slipped up on the date for a second. If you just joined, I had asked people to put in the chat whether or not this is a topic that they have had a training on before or have seen a presentation on. It's always interesting to see, how many people have heard about this before, as well as how many people, maybe haven't gotten a chance to learn about this. Okay. So, just kind of going over a little bit of, not really ground rules, but I'll call them ground rules anyway. We're going to be going over your questions and having a discussion at the very end. When you send a message in the chat, make sure that you check your recipients. If you hit everybody here will see it. But sometimes, I know like my default will say like host and panelist or just have somebody's name. And if you have it for like host and panelist, that doesn't mean that other participants will be seeing it. Also check your view on Zoom. Sometimes we know we have difficulties making sure everyone can see the interpreter or myself, or like see the PowerPoint slide large enough. You might need to adjust your view on Zoom. And the last thing is that this recording will be uploaded onto our website. Okay, our agenda. So what we're going to be talking about today is different types of abuse, barriers that people with disabilities experience that affects reporting as well as seeking help. We're talking about different effects that domestic violence can have. In particular, we'll be talking about it around employment. We'll also talk about ways that we can respond and sort of help to provide support. And then at the end, we'll also go over some services and some resources. So it'll be like educational resources, but also I have some links to Indiana-specific resources that have to do with domestic violence and disability. All right, so kicking it off, we're going to talk about the overview and the prevalence. So people with disabilities are victims of violent crimes at much higher rates. In the past, whenever I've given this presentation, there's usually a bullet here where I'll say it's believed to be underreported. And check that out, one, to make more space, but also because now, there are bullets here that kind of show that point that I was making. So originally, for the longest time, like the information I was using was from 2017 data that was saying that people with disabilities experience violent victimization at 2 times the rate. Now we have more recent data. So even though we have data from 2019, this report was not published on it until 2021. And now they see that people with disabilities experience violent victimization at 4 times the rate as people without disabilities. So that is double from what was being said just 2 years ago. So I think that really speaks to that point that this is greatly underreported. And I'm not confident that it still isn't underreported because, at that bottom here, we'll see that 70% of people with disability reported having experienced some form of abuse. This was with the national survey that was done actually back in 2012. And for a while, it was one of the most comprehensive ones that existed. And so this one did touch on abuse in different forms. It had different age range that it looked at. It considered instances of bullying. And the way that they got the survey out was different as opposed to the one with this 2019 data. In that 2019 data, the comparison was that it was 49 per 1,000 people with disabilities experienced violent victimization as compared to 12 people without disabilities. The highest rate was among people with cognitive disabilities, and that jumped all the way up to 83 per 1,000 people. And this here is referring to people with disabilities ages 12 and up. And what I think is interesting is that something that may have caused that big change in number is that this survey is the National Crime Survey that goes out. It's the one that is typically used the most, cited the most is through the Department of Justice. And they originally were not asking individuals if they had a disability. They were just sort of sending out the survey and using like secondary population data from the American Community Survey to sort of estimate how many people were experiencing it. Once they started to put that question in themselves with the same exact definition of disability, the numbers changed a lot. So what is domestic violence? A lot of times when people hear domestic violence, the very first thing that comes to their mind is partners, like a husband and a wife, or a boyfriend and a girlfriend, or a girlfriend and girlfriend. But domestic violence is actually pretty broad. The definition of it does vary by states. And so I'm going to just sort of explain the best definition that I'll be using going forward. It's referring to abuse that happens between family members or household members. I picked that because that is a piece that usually is included in the legal definitions. And they also often emphasize that it's something that's happening knowingly or intentionally. So the person who is doing the abuse is doing it knowingly or intentionally. And so intentionally is different from knowingly, because someone may not be plotting, like, I'm going to do this to this person. But when they're doing those choices anyway, maybe they're not necessarily thinking about like that, but there's still intention behind it. Intimate partner violence is what I was saying people often picture when we say domestic violence. This is specific to partners, both current or past, and romantic or sexual. So looking at Indiana law, law is not my area of expertise. I won't go into it too much. Some of the resources I share at the end, like an Indiana specific one, there's part on their website where they talk about they can give people training on this. They are someone that seems to be a recommended resource to go to if you're looking for information to understand the law around it. But so this I put here just to show how broad family or household member is. So it doesn't have to be somebody who is currently living in the home with you. It doesn't have to be necessarily somebody that you do have a blood relationship with. It can be both your current or a former spouse of somebody. They don't even have to be dating at the time. Some states are a bit more, well, I'm not going to say because I don't know how broad Indiana gets, but I know, for example, in Utah, there are cases that it can be someone somebody was dating and they are no longer dating more, but still those instances get considered as domestic violence. They're not in a relationship and they're not in that same home anymore. The other interesting piece is that with Indiana law, they separate domestic violence is in one sort of section of the law, and then domestic battery is in another section. And then if you go to Indiana family law, there is another sort of definition there as well. And it just goes to show that this is really broad. There are cases too where like it's justified whether or not it has like what people would usually picture. I think a lot of times when we think of domestic violence, we jump to picturing that physical violence, whereas physical violence does not have to happen in order for something to be considered domestic violence. For someone to be charged, it doesn't have to include physical violence. There can be threats of it. It can be that person being scared that it's going to happen. For example, threat and use of a deadly weapon, and that top definition can be a gun that is not loaded. There's been a case where it was a rock, and because they can show the intent and the reasoning behind why that person had that fear, that was considered a deadly weapon. There are a lot of things that can be considered it. I know, for example, in Utah, even stalking and cyberbullying, those things can be justified as well. So the intersections, well, abuse increases the chance of disability in the sense that someone can acquire a disability. They may not have had a disability when they entered the relationship or when they experienced abuse within family or whoever it was, but they end up acquiring a disability because of it. One of the more common examples is a TBI, so traumatic brain injury. And that's something that stays with someone. It's a disability that they acquired because of the abuse. I have someone who shares a story, who co-presents with me a lot, and has had TBI for a very long time, is now eating out of a feeding tube because of the abusive relationship they were in before. Also, another connection that, not everybody always thinks about is that abuse that's happening to a mother, while they are pregnant, that is affecting the child. They found that that can have effects on their mental health afterwards. They found that women that are experiencing domestic violence, it increases the chance of the baby experiencing fussiness. They can have other sort of like emotional problems because the stress that that mother is experiencing increases those cortisol levels. And that is actually affecting, the child. And a baby's brain is not, really equipped to deal with those high levels of cortisol that early on. I mean, even children really young aren't. And that has an effect. That's sort of what puts us in that fight or flight situation. giving us that feeling of that fight or flight situation. And so they have found that, even after the child's born, they have found that, babies can seem more fearful, like it can have this lasting effect on children. The other thing too is that when the mother is experiencing abuse, the child, they found there's an increased risk of them being born premature, experiencing miscarriage, low birth weight. These are things that, we know happen. We might think that just because they're not there, they aren't being impacted by this, but that is not the case. This is something I talk about myself too, as a survivor. I do like to disclose that because I think this is a sensitive topic, and people do appreciate knowing that the person talking about it, is coming from someplace. And my daughter was born like 2.5 months early, and that I generally believe was a factor because it just where it came out of nowhere, and the timing sort of lined up. And so yeah, she was incredibly premature, and those things really do have an effect. The other way that there's an intersection is that disability increases the chance of abuse. So we were just talking about that, looking at those rates. People with disabilities are, experience much more risk, have a higher risk of experiencing abuse. We've also found that they tend to, when they're in abusive relationships, they tend to be longer. That was looking at cases that didn't being reported to police, and they have found, looking at their numbers, that people with disabilities were in abusive relationships for longer. So we had talked about that people with disabilities are more likely to experience abuse. Also, they are often less likely to report it as opposed to someone without a disability. And I do want to take a second to ask you guys, why do you think having a disability increases the chance of someone experiencing abuse? I'm going to open up my chat so I can see. Thanks for answering the earlier question. So the question is, why do you think that having a disability increases the chance of experiencing abuse? Fear of not being believed. Thank you, Pamela. That's going to come up on the slides. Other times when I ask this, people throw out answers and like, yeah, a lot of the things that you would expect as being one of the reasons why it does end up being a factor. They might not be able to get out if they're in a wheelchair, or they might not understand what's happening to them. Not feeling protected is really good. I'm going to go to the next slide, and you guys are going to see like, hey, yeah, I was right. So risk factors, in general, any limitation to a person's ability to independently perform activities of daily living increases risk. So it's because that's increasing those areas for control. So it's essentially making it easier for somebody to abuse their control over somebody, especially, given all those different areas, they can control their health. They can control if they're going to doctor's appointments. They know that this person has to rely on them. And so some of the risk factors that people with disabilities experience in general also contribute to this, to the increased risk of experiencing abuse, but it's a very continuous factor because that's also contributing to why it can be difficult to report, why they might not want to seek help, even from people that they're close to. It can be barriers for accessing services. So it's increasing the risk, like from the very beginning, being more likely to experience abuse. Then when they're in it, these are the same factors that can keep them in it for longer. And these are the same factors that will impact, that step at the end if they, decide that they want to try to get out of that relationship or that situation. These are all pieces that are going to make every single step harder along the way. So some of just the specific ones, an increased risk of isolation. That goes along with it because a lot of times that is what happens in abusive relationships. The partner ends up isolating that person so that they aren't seeing their family as much or their friends as much. So then they don't really have someone to go to when they do need to seek help. And it can happen in a lot of different ways. It can be getting mad at them when they want to go see this person. It can be talking badly about your friends. So then you almost start to feel embarrassed about who you're friends with. Or, if you do hang out with them, they're going to say something about it. Limited access to transportation. I want to say somebody mentioned that one. Use of interpreters or assistive devices is just another form of control that somebody can abuse over someone to make it harder for them to report or even tell other people what is going on. Even if they have reached that point where they are ready to report, they might not actually be able to because that person has made it that way. So barriers to reporting and seeking help. This was one that somebody said was feeling that they don't think somebody would believe them. It was the most common reason, and this I'll say is coming from one of the surveys I talked about from the beginning, the one that was done like in 2012, where 70% of people said they had experienced abuse. And the most common reason there was that they said they didn't believe something would happen if they did report. And the sad thing is that the people that had that fear, a lot of times that ended up being true, because so half of the people who did experience it ended up reporting, and then half of those said that nothing was done when they did. Another common reason was, what if I report and something does happen? Which maybe seems a little bit odd, because isn't that why you're reporting in the first place? Like, why would that be something you're worried about? But let's think about it. If they're in a situation where their partner or their family member is someone that they are really dependent on, there is that fear of, okay, well, how am I going to, get assistance in these areas that I need if that person is no longer part of my life? And consider again that they may have been isolated. So as people that would be like, oh, well, why can't you go to your family for help? Their relationship with them may have been damaged. And that means they might not feel like they have somebody to go to anymore. The other thing was not knowing how to report or who to report to. And then just some numbers on it right here that shows how it can be more difficult for people with disabilities to report abuse. And this is something that we've seen in the numbers. 90% of rapes or sexual assault against people with disabilities were reported to the police, and that is talking about people with disabilities, as compared to 36% being reported with people without disabilities. Something that I did think was encouraging, though, is that there was an increase in the amount of people that were receiving victim services. 6% in 2020, it went up to 9% in 2021. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about different types of abuse. Starting off with the one that I think sometimes we most often think of is physical abuse. So we might picture things such as punching, kicking, choking, hair pulling. But so even things that are not actually, hitting you directly still can count as physical abuse. That can include damaging property. So it can be punching walls, it can be throwing objects. Those things can also be considered physical abuse. And I will say too here that it's not like these things are black or white, where it's like this is just one form of abuse and that's it. They often overlap. You'll see that kind of as we go through. It's not really clear cut, but I think it helps to go through sections and just sort of talk about the different ways that it can look. Preventing partner from eating or sleeping. That is physical abuse. You are affecting somebody's basic needs, their physical well-being. And you might be wondering, well, how is it that they're preventing them from eating or sleeping? It can be intentionally like moving the bed when somebody is trying to sleep so that they're not able to. That takes a giant toll on somebody. If you're only sleeping a few hours for an extended period of time, keeping them from eating, taking away even like the bedding so that they will have more trouble sleeping. Those are just some examples of abuse. That's physical abuse. Other types of abuse is sexual. That's another one I think that comes to mind. And I apologize because I should have said this earlier. Just that if we do talk about something that makes you uncomfortable, I want you to know that you could absolutely turn off your camera. If you need to leave, please do so. I'm not going to be offended. I think these are difficult things to talk about in here, especially if someone has had, experience with any of these things. So just to let you know, sorry, I should have said it earlier. And there will be a case that we'll go over at the end too that can be triggering for some people. So sexual abuse can be forcing sexual acts, forcing the person to do sexual acts with you, forcing them to do it to others even, using someone's drugs to lower their inhibition. So intentionally giving somebody alcohol because you know that they won't be able to sort of like stop your advances as much, or just thinking that is going to make them more willing to. And so I think this is one reason too why people may feel like, oh, it wouldn't be sexual abuse because they didn't say no or that they didn't try hard enough. That's not the case. You should not have to say no. Part of that getting consent is, getting sort of like your body language. The consent's giving in a lot of different ways beyond verbal, and you can tell sometimes. But also the thing is that you shouldn't have to be pressuring somebody into it. You shouldn't be guilting somebody for not having sex with you. These are all things that can fall under sexual abuse. Making a partner feel scared about what will happen if they say no. And here is a fact that I think is very upsetting, but I do feel like people should know. Sometimes we think that people with disabilities would not be experiencing sexual abuse. That is a myth that some people believe. It's not the case. In particular, talking about individuals with intellectual disability, they've been found that they experience sexual assault 7 times more than people without disabilities. And even though it says NPR, it was based on a study they had done going through Department of Justice data. Emotional verbal. So emotional abuse can be continually criticizing or insulting somebody, that isolating them from their friends or family, withholding affection as punishment, and then trying to control somebody's appearance, such as saying what they can or can't wear. It might not even actually be telling them that, hey, you can't wear that, you can't put on makeup. It can be that whenever somebody does make those choices to wear what they want to, the other person is criticizing them whenever they do and making them uncomfortable. They may even say things that are embarrassing when they're in front of friends. These are all different ways of controlling without actually saying, hey, you can or can't do that. Psychological abuse. This is in a different section, depending where you look, because some places will consider emotional abuse and psychological abuse to be the same thing. There is a bit of an element that can make it different. So psychological abuse, sort of think of like gaslighting. There is this manipulation piece that is essentially being done in a way that makes that person question their own sanity in a way. They begin to not trust themselves. They might think that they're just not having a good understanding of reality. So examples would be changing the description of events. It can be having an argument with somebody, and then they sort of start to say that, hey, I never said that, I didn't do that, but pushing it so hard to the point that that person starts questioning whether or not that is something that happened or was said. Other examples is the partner threatening to kill themselves, threatening to kill the partner. Children are often used sort of as almost like weapons against the person sometimes, saying that they will harm the kids or say that they're going to leave them and that they're not going to have rights to them, that they won't let them see them. Harming their pets, including service animals. That's something where, again, someone may not have ever physically harmed you, but seeing what they can do to, for example, your dog, it's going to make you fear what it is that that person can do to you. In instances too, it's taking away sort of that support that you do have, that thing that is bringing you that comfort when these sort of abusive situations are happening, and now this person is taking away that comfort that you have. And it might be your only comfort if you aren't actually seeing your friends or your family anymore. Threatening to take away the children or report the partner to Child Protective Services. It's one that's not on here, but is one that actually does come up. I had done a needs assessment in Utah, specifically for domestic violence services for Hispanic women. And in talking to shelters, they had said that was a common reason why some women said they were not trying to leave the relationship, why they didn't want to report it, was that the partner was saying that they would have them taken out of the country because they weren't legal. Whereas that is not a question that was going to be coming up, at least here with our law enforcement. They don't have the justification to do that if you're reaching out for help in that situation. Other types of abuse, so financial and economic abuse. That's not allowing somebody to have a job, intentionally ruining their credit. That is a giant barrier for people in legal relationships or the other abusive situation, because they don't feel that they can financially support themselves, especially when we're talking about people with disabilities. Misusing, controlling, or taking somebody's money. And spiritual abuse is another example that we might not always think about. In Utah, that is actually one that has come up quite a bit. There are support groups dedicated to this. So it can be ridiculing someone because of their beliefs, preventing someone from practicing their religious or spiritual beliefs, using someone's beliefs against them to either justify the abuse, to shame the person or manipulate them. Examples would be that it is not rape because we are married. That is one that people have used the Bible to try to justify, to say that that is something that the woman owes the man. Another example too, that is one that I've heard come up here in Utah, where I'm located, is if somebody has a position of power in a church, that makes the other person a lot more scared of reporting. They feel that they will be shunned from their sort of social circle, their community. And so it leads them to not want to tell their people. Or if they do, they are seen negatively as if they are lying. And why would they be painting this picture about somebody that other people look up to and respect? So we talked about some examples that anybody can experience. So people with disabilities can experience all of those types of abuse, every single type. But in addition, there are some sort of disability-specific examples that adds this other layer to it of ways that people with disabilities can experience abuse. So for example, if that person helps them with a medication, there's times where they can withhold it. They can sort of manipulate how much they're taking. They can force them to take too much. They can use it almost as leverage over somebody to try to get them to do something they don't want, especially if it's a medication that they rely on heavily. Denying access to transportation to doctor's appointments. So that's something that can be a red flag. If you have noticed that someone is regularly going to his appointments and then at some point it seems like they're just not going anymore, or the nature of it is a bit different when they do show up, where all of a sudden they're not talking as much, like speaking for themselves even. Inappropriate touching while assisting with hygiene or dressing. This is one that has come up before in other trainings that have been given to individuals with disabilities. This is with my co-presenters, where people didn't realize that what they were experiencing was abuse, because they have been like assisted with their hygiene and getting dressed for years, and they never realized that it was something that wasn't appropriate. So there's sometimes that when people hear examples, they realize, oh, that's not okay. That's not the way that someone's supposed to be assisting me in those situations. Another example is stealing or withholding a partner's social security check. Some more examples. So this one would be more along what I would say is psychological abuse, is shaming or telling the partner that they deserve the abuse because of their disability. Gaslighting or invalidating a partner's disability by saying that they're faking it or that is in their head. Another example would be damaging or denying access to assistive technology, such as wheelchairs or communication devices. So I have a real life example here that before reading, this is one that I will preface that I'll say that I think can be really difficult for some people to hear. I did want to include it because I think having an understanding of how it can look like really makes this topic more real for some people. I did take out pieces of it that I felt could be especially difficult for people to hear, but that title up there where it says real life example is a hyperlink in case anybody did want to click on it to read it. This woman had talked about, it was when she was a senior in college, and this was her experience with her partner. So my boyfriend and I had moved in together rather rapidly. I was okay with that because I required attendant care services. I'm a quadriplegic as a result of an automobile accident when I was 16 years old. The relationship was great for about 6 months. Then he started becoming very controlling and jealous. He wanted to get married soon. After he proposed, I said that I would marry him if we had a long engagement. After we had become engaged, he started referring to me as a pretty bird in a cage. And after that, the emotional and verbal abuse that I was experiencing rapidly escalated into physical violence. During an argument, I was on the living room floor, and he was watching me as I cried and tried to scoot my body towards the telephone so I could call for help. The third incident was an argument we were having. While we were driving in the car, he pulled off to the side of the road, went around to my side of the car, pulled me out of the car to where I was laid on the side of the pavement. I asked if he would leave my wheelchair, and he did not. I think this shows why it can be very difficult for people to leave these abusive situations when you sort of consider, all these fears that somebody has. And if someone were experiencing things already to this point, I think there's good reason for wondering about what else somebody is capable of doing. There's some elements in this story that is common across a lot of abusive situations. The wanting to escalate a relationship quickly, so like trying to get somebody to commit very early on, because they know that once somebody's engaged or once somebody is married, it's likely going to be a lot harder for them to want to leave that relationship. So sometimes, that physical abuse doesn't actually start happening till after they already feel as if they sort of kind of got that hold on somebody, where they're a lot less likely to leave. The other thing too is that she had talked about it starting off great for those 6 months. So a lot of times it can feel almost like it is straight out of a book or some sort of fairy tale, because the relationship just seems so magical and so wonderful that this person is the kindest person you've ever met. To an extent, is what we're talking about, knowingly or intentionally. Someone might not be plotting it, but there are intentions behind it to make the relationship seem that way in the very beginning, because then it always gives something for a person to hold on to. There's always that thought of, well, it might not always be like this because it hasn't always been like this, or I know that they really care about me because of how it was in the beginning. So effects that it can have on employment can be being late or missing work. You might think that somebody, is just tardy a lot, or that it's their own fault. You really don't know what is going on. This can happen as well with people, like if they're in college as well. It can be, again, with doctor's appointments. You don't know what's happening on the other end that's actually making them regularly late, which is why I have a little bit of a pet peeve when sometimes, and it can happen to mental health therapists sometimes, where if somebody misses too many appointments in a row, or if they're late too many times, they will no longer see that person. But I think we do all deserve grace, again, because we don't really know what's happening. And there can be things going on that are making them late. The person might seem distracted while they're at work, and it can be because of that stress. And you don't know if they are receiving text messages while they're at work that are probably really distressing to read. And it's going to be affecting their attention, which I think we could all understand. When you're sort of worrying about like your basic needs or what's going to happen when you go home, it makes sense that you're probably going to be distracted when you are at work. Someone might seem really tired, again, it can be stress, or it can be that partner not letting them sleep. It can also be because of hypervigilance. They might be having difficulty sleeping because they are always feeling on edge because something might happen. It's sort of that PTSD response where you can become a lot more jumpy. And even if things in the relationship have been good for a while, or it can be with family, even in those long periods where it seems that things are very good, that person can still have that jumpiness, because once you experience something to that level, that fear doesn't go away easily. And withdrawing from other people. That can be a natural response to, I think, just when you are in that situation. It's going to make sense if somebody starts to become depressed, and that can just kind of come along with it sometimes. So it might not even be that the partner is intentionally keeping them away from friends or family. They might just begin to withdraw from themselves. Some recommendations, and some of these I would say are also considerations, is not minimizing somebody. So if we are working with somebody who has disclosed, or that we know used to be in an abusive situation, whether it was a family member or a partner, and say that they got out of the relationship and they got a protective order, which I know in some states is kind of the highest level that you can get, because there are restraining orders. There are some that is strictly just about no communication. Protective orders, kind of the highest one, at least I know in our state, that you can get. They can be put in place for years. Some states will allow from 7 to 10 years. And so we might think, hey, you don't have a reason to be scared still, because that's in place. They're not allowed to come see you. They don't have your address. They don't know where you live. They're not allowed to find out. They're not even allowed to message you. But that risk is still there. And that person is probably still feeling that fear because they know things that perhaps you don't know. The extent to which that person is willing to go to, and how someone can react when they feel that they don't have that control over somebody anymore. They can sort of start to scramble in a way and grab at anything that they can to essentially hurt that person. Identify who at the workplace they would alert, where they can go for safety, who to contact. So this is essentially just making a safety plan. So this is something that there are templates online. They have plain language versions of templates as well. Domestic violence shelters, they will often do this with people, if not always. And so they don't have to be working with the person while they're still in that situation. It can be after the fact. They can still go there and make that safety plan with them. And it's something that, even if for some reason we think, oh, well, do you really need it because it's been so long? It's really not going to hurt to have one. It's good to have it just in case. And they're not difficult to do. And so it really does just involve, if a situation were to come up, who are the people you're going to go to first? Who should we contact? And if we're talking about, like, it might depend on the workplace, but identifying a place where they can go, say if that person were to come up, like to show up at the workplace, finding sort of like a space that they're able to go that the other person wouldn't be able to enter themselves. Having educational information and information about crisis center or shelter information posted. So that's just talking about in your office, having that even on like your wall somewhere, like the information for local domestic violence shelter, having educational information just showing what abuse is. I know a popular resource that people see too is like the cycle of abuse. And these are things that it is really easy to get in denial about certain things because nobody wants to, accept the fact that, maybe this person that you love, because you might still love them, are doing these things, and that it's considered abuse. So even when things happen that from the outside we might think are very blatantly abuse, the person might not realize that. It can take a long time to realize that. And so having those educational pieces up can actually make a change for somebody. And also having those posted up in bathrooms is something I've seen done, which is actually great. I will say for myself, that's one of the first things I saw that kind of got me to think about it. Like, okay, if I were to reach out to help, like this is where I could go. And almost like seeing it pop up in more places. For example, you'll see it in hospitals sometimes. You'll see it in doctors' offices. It's just almost like planting the seed a little bit. So eventually maybe when somebody is ready, they'll at least know about where they can go. And promoting self-determination is even more important now. So I know we hear about that a lot, like in general, that everybody has the right to self-determination, which is just deciding what your goals are, deciding how you want to reach those goals. And people with disabilities aren't always given that right, or they're not treated like they have that right. So in general, people with disabilities might not be used to getting to like make their own decisions in a way. So when we work with people, we like to really emphasize like choice and let them like make their own decisions. Like even if it's something like little, all these things can promote self-determination. And even though I think it is important for every single person to have this, the reasoning why I put is even more important now is because someone really may not trust himself anymore. They might second guess everything they do because they have started to just sort of like, I want to say ingrain, I don't know if ingrain is the right word, but you start to believe these things that you've been told about yourself for years and years. And maybe from the outside, everyone's like, oh, but you're so smart, you're so confident. Like, why would you feel that way about yourself? When it's all you've heard for a very long time, you definitely start to believe it. So I think helping somebody, practice that self-determination, especially after or during like being in an abusive situation, is incredibly important. It can help increase the chances of them wanting to get out. And it's going to be important afterwards to make those decisions for yourself and sort of become independent. So some considerations. There's that common question that we hear is, why don't they just leave? I like to think that some of the things that we talked about sort of like help answer that question, because it's not an easy thing to just get out of. And the other thing too is that when we have that attitude, it makes someone less likely to want to tell you. And it doesn't have to be that they told you about it and then you have that response. It can be just hearing people talk in general about like people in abusive situations. Like I've heard this come up before, like not in like personal conversations, just like reading about the news or something like, well, why don't they just leave? Well, it's really not that easy. We know for a fact, like the amount of homicides that happen related to domestic violence are highest in the time that the person is trying to leave that relationship. It's not while they've been in it and they weren't trying to leave. That risk jumps up dramatically. There's also this myth, good-bad dichotomy, meaning that from the outside, you may view that person as just being all bad. There's this horrible, evil person. How is it that you can still care about them? How is it that you still want to stay in this situation? And why don't you view them this way? Because a lot of times the person might defend that family member or that partner, whoever it is. And I've heard it called before as like the domestic Stockholm syndrome, which, referring to, usually it's used talking about like hostage situations where the person who's being held hostage starts to like have Like they don't view the person who's putting up the situation negatively. They almost begin to defend them. This is something that happens in these relationships, and it is absolutely a survival technique. You have to sort of like tell yourself these things. You have to believe that that person isn't all bad, to make that situation feel more bearable. So that's just something that I don't think we should be judging if we hear somebody do. And the other thing is that, again, on the outside, they might look all bad, but you don't know what it looks like in the beginning. And a lot of times there is this cycle. There might be an incident that happens, and then there's like this honeymoon phase. The person apologizes for it. They say that they won't do it again. And it can go on for a good period of time. You know, when people start to believe that, hey, they really changed. And they might make efforts to change as well. Like somebody might go to therapy. So just ask the reasons for why someone would start having that hope that things can change and why they might view that person that way. It's just not as black and white as it might seem from the outside sometimes. So that's just the reason behind why they might not view that person as all good or all bad, because they do see sides of them where they are loving towards them. Isolation and lack of support makes leaving seem promising, even difficult to imagine. Someone might reach the point where they feel that they are objectively sort of seeing the situation for what it is. It's a bad situation. They need to get out of it. This person is not treating me the way they should. But then you have to think about who else is going to start helping you, which is something we talked about too. But also you might start thinking that nobody else would care about you. In particular, this is one that will come up like in relationships. Someone has been sort of beaten down enough that they start to believe those negative thoughts about themselves, and they might think that nobody else would ever want to be with them. And the thought of being alone can be more terrifying than staying in that relationship, because at least sometimes you feel like there's somebody that does care about you. We talked about how one of the effects of these relationships can be questioning yourself, questioning your own judgment. And so it doesn't have to be the point where you question like reality to the extent whether or not you remember things wrong. It can just be that not being confident in your own choices that you're making, not thinking that you are capable of doing all the things you need to do to start sustaining yourself afterwards. And that bottom point there is what I was talking about, the risk increases. 75% of domestic violence related homicides occur upon separation. So, reporting in Indiana. Indiana is a mandatory report state. I won't go super in depth in this because like I said, there's the resources that are willing to do training and have information on this. I don't live in Indiana, as I believe you guys know at this point. So these aren't going to be the laws that I'm most familiar with. I still think it's important that we cover it. A lot of states are mandatory report states. So that means that you're required to report cases of suspected neglect, battery, or exploitation of an endangered adult to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement. So emphasis on that word suspected. You don't have to know for a fact it's happening. You don't have to see it happen. If you have that suspicion, everyone's supposed to be reporting it. And this is not just talking about people in certain jobs. This is everybody has that requirement essentially. You don't have to be a doctor or be working in a specific position to have to be required to report that. And people can actually be charged for not reporting it. I don't know how much that actually happens, but also if we feel somebody might be in that situation, it typically is better to sort of lean on that side of caution and not just sort of be like, oh, well, it probably isn't happening. And what's considered an endangered adult? So this is taken from Indiana law specifically. It's somebody who is at least 18 years old, and this is verbatim how they have it written. Incapable by reason of mental illness, intellectual disability, dementia, habitual drunkenness, excessive drug use, or other physical or mental incapacity of managing or directing the management of the individual's property or providing self-care. Sorry, it's a little bit lengthy. And then when it says it's harmed or threatened, it's saying that it doesn't have to be that person experienced it. They could have experienced it, and that's one reason that you have to report, but also them just being threatened. And it lists 3 things here. This is usually the terminology that Adult Protective Services uses, is abuse, neglect, or exploitation. All of these are still forms of abuse. So neglect should be, making so that person can't meet their basic needs, taking away, it can be food, not providing everything that they are supposed to be providing. Exploitation can be financial exploitation, using that person's money. It can be exploiting the individual, such as sexual exploitation. recording them doing things to use it to your own advantage because that person might be gaining something out of that, whether it's monetary or some other form of benefit. And now we're coming to the end here. So we'll have questions and discussions really soon. So this first one here is not Indiana specific. It is endabusefpeoplewithdisabilities.org. It's a wonderful website. I very much recommend it. They have lots of webinars. They have online courses. They have a collection of resources outside of their own. They have a newsletter that you can sign up for, which I like because then you get notified of when they're going to have certain webinars, and they're always recorded as well, so you can view them afterwards. But they have trainings on topics that are very specific to abuse and people with disabilities that aren't easily found, I think, in other situations. This is typically how I hear about them. So there's some about improving services specifically for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. They have some specifically on accessibility. I just really recommend that you check that one out. That's why I don't have a long list of resources, because I think this is one that has a lot of the pieces there. And I did also want to include some Indiana specific ones. So there's Indiana Disability Rights, their abuse and neglect team. They are ones that help investigate into situations where people with disabilities might be experiencing abuse. The Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Indiana Disability Justice, that bottom one there that I just said, Indiana Disability Justice, they have a section too where it links to individual stories, so people with disabilities who have experienced abuse. And they have pictures of art that they've made around this topic as well. And a point that I forgot to make on the last one is that there's that requirement to report. So there's a requirement to report to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement, like calling 911. If it's a situation where somebody is in immediate danger, you call 911. Adult Protective Services usually will take the report that you made, maybe open up a case with it, and they send out an investigator. That doesn't always happen at that moment. A lot of times it doesn't, just sort of depends on the context. So it can take days, and they might investigate it for weeks. But again, if it's something that's seeming immediate, you should be going to law. Okay, here we are. Questions, thoughts, anything. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. There's also a Q&A box you can use as well. I think you can use either one.
I will also allow people to talk. It'll take just a second.
Thank you. If you do feel nervous talking or you don't want to unmute yourself, though, please feel free to use the chat. I know I like having both options. If there's any recommendations or considerations you think people should have that you want to share, please do so. I think we can all learn from each other, and you guys have a lot of experience working with individuals, and I think you got some great things that you could share with us. I'm going to go through the chat here just to see what comments have come up there like this. That's a good question. Virginia wrote, I have a client who smells so badly every time I get her. I have talked with her mom and she just doesn't know what to do. Is this neglect? So that can be one thing, whereas people are denied sort of the ability to take care of their hygiene, or the person who's supposed to be helping them is not. There are also situations too where the individual might not want to, and the person that usually helps them doesn't know how to address that. So I think it really depends on the situation. I don't think that's super black and white.
Yeah, she is refusing to, do stuff for herself. She refuses to go to the bathroom, to use the bathroom. She pees in a cup. I don't know what she does about the other part of her body, but I'm to the point where, employers won't even hire her because she smells so bad. And I just don't know what to do about it. I brought it up to the VR counselor. I've talked to her mom about it, and she's beside herself. I don't know if it's just comes down to a mental thing, or, I feel like her mom is trying somewhat, but I don't know if I should report it as abuse or not.
Well, you can always call and ask questions about it. like say, hey, I don't know whether or not this is something I'm supposed to be reporting. And they will sort of talk through that with you. Worst case scenario is like they can put a note in it, and even if it isn't something they end up investigating, if something's reported again later on, that note's still there, sort of associated with that person in that case. So then if they see that something's a pattern over time, that can sort of speak to that in a way. I feel like you are in a difficult situation. If someone else has had this experience, please feel free to, put something in the chat or talk or sort of help give Virginia some guidance.
Yeah, I don't feel like she's been abused that I could tell, physically or emotionally, things like that in the past. I know she has had a boyfriend, and I don't know how that boyfriend treats her. I know the parents don't like her having this boyfriend, but I'm just not sure. I mean, yes, I'm wondering if she's even showering at this point. I'm not sure.
As someone, well, I would just say, like, if someone hasn't asked her what the reasoning is behind it, like her thoughts on it, it'd be interesting to know what they share about it as well. Again, I don't know situations, I'm not saying this is it, but I can also say that there are instances where people who have experienced sexual abuse, even if it was in the past or when they were younger, sometimes that happens, the not taking care of your hygiene as a response in a way to sort of protect himself from that happening again. Mm-hmm. Again, it's just really not black and white, and with limited information, it's so hard to know. So I think it's just worth having that conversation.
Okay.
And I can't give you more guidance than that right now.
Thank you.
And you know what, Virginia, reporting this situation and circumstance to APS would at least spark an investigation. Hopefully, you may be doing mom and dad a favor. You don't have to necessarily say that you believe they're being neglectful. You can just say this adult is, even maybe self-neglect. I mean, perhaps she's just not enrolled in services, and this might spark something to happen for the person.
Yeah, we are trying to get her. She has applied for the Medicaid waiver. They're waiting on a few things, a form from one of the parents, and she's going to be working on that. And they've gotten a psychological evaluation for her. So I'm just kind of waiting to see, what's going to happen with that. So I just wasn't sure how far I should take this, since it seems like something is trying to be done about it. Yeah.
Will say
that's my question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish what you were saying.
No, I was just saying that's why I'm questioning. It seems like they're trying to get something done about it, but it just constantly continues to be a problem, and it's months now.
I was just going to add the piece too that when you sort of read the mandatory reporting law, it says that even if someone has a suspicion that they think that another agency or somebody else is going to be reporting it, that doesn't necessarily count as justification for not doing it. It really is kind of better to lean on that side of caution, in my opinion. And I think there's some comments in here too saying about situations people have heard of. That again, if something is happening, it'd be better to address it just in case. And I think Carla had a really, really good point there too. That can help sort of spark things and get those services. And also, if it is the individual sort of making that choice, and if it is some form of self-neglect, I think, having something escalate to being a case can potentially be an eye-opener.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I didn't even think about self-neglect. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate all the thoughts.
Thanks for joining the discussion. Thanks, Carla. Let's see. How we bring up domestic violence with potential employers. I have a client who has a PO against her ex. She's protective order against her ex. She's currently looking for work as a badger/guest services in a public job. Will this harm her chances of finding work? It really should not. I feel like that would it's like a form of discrimination. That was a little bit difficult because I feel like that's something that typically is best for the individual to tell them themselves, but I think that they can have that conversation with you, about sort of how they want to address it, if they need to sort of like role play out how they would tell them, or if they want help telling them. It really shouldn't harm your chances of finding work. Unfortunately, in the world, just because something shouldn't happen doesn't mean it won't. But I think it's an important thing to know, is to at least make that safety plan with the employer, in my opinion, because people will show up to other people's work. APS can escalate the need to get a waiver. Let's see. It's drastic. Would a report potentially push for? Understand the severity of the issue, and then if there's a piece, it could be found. Very good point, Samantha. Yes, having a safety plan is essential. You've been doing, I think you've been managing the comments throughout. If I'm missing anything, please let me know, because I know for a fact I haven't seen all of them because I haven't had this box pulled up the whole time. If anyone wants to unmute themselves just to share something, please feel free. I have my email too that I put in the end, so if anyone thinks something afterward that you wanted to reach out about, please email me. Also, those resources about the Indiana specific ones, they seem like really good resources too. Like especially like in the situation that you were wondering about Virginia, I think they would be really good to reach out to.
And Samantha had a good comment to Ginger about, is there a history of abuse prior to the current concern? If it was a past, in her past position, some of her previously sexual abuse clients had a hard time showering, and just something for her to consider. We have 2 minutes left. I want to thank you, Tatiana. This has been just very insightful for folks. And we will also put some of these references on the Level Up website or resources that Tatiana has mentioned. So look at the love, that's nice.
I appreciate it, guys. I really do. This is one of the things that I am most passionate talking about. So seeing that you guys have stuck around to the end makes me really happy. Please just let me know whenever you want me to stop sharing. Thanks for doing that. Thanks, Michaela, for joining us as well.
Okay, it's just about the top of the hour. I'm going to leave it on because people are praising you, Tatiana.
Well, thanks. This is a great way to start my day. It's morning over here for me, so I think it's funny it's a lunch one, but thanks. This is already the highlight of my day. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.